There is a civilization you have never heard of. It built the foundations of the world you live in. It gave you your calendar, your alphabet, your concept of law, your mathematics, and then, at the height of its power, it vanished. Not slowly, not through war or famine alone. It collapsed so completely that for thousands of years, the people who came after had no idea it had ever existed. This is not a story about Egypt. It is not about Rome or Greece. Those empires knew they were standing on someone else's ruins. This is about the civilization that came before all of them, the one that was so thoroughly erased that modern historians only rediscovered it in the last 200 years. You are about to find out what they found. It begins in a river valley. Two rivers, actually, the Tigris and the Euphrates. If you look at a modern map, you are looking at what is now southern Iraq. But 4,000 years before the birth of Christ, this land was not a desert. It was green, it was lush, it was impossibly fertile. And into that landscape, a group of people arrived that archaeologists today call the Sumerians. Where they came from, nobody knows. They called themselves the black-headed people. They called their land Sumer. And what they built there changed everything. They built cities, real cities, not villages, not farming settlements. Cities with walls and streets and temples and marketplaces. The city of Uruk, at its peak around 3100 BCE, was home to an estimated 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, the population of London at that same period was a few thousand at most. Uruk was not a town. It was a metropolis, and it was only one of dozens of Sumerian cities stretching across the southern plain. But it is not the size of the cities that makes Sumer remarkable. It is what happened inside them. The Sumerians invented writing, not just scratches on a wall, a complete, functional writing system called cuneiform, pressed into wet clay tablets using a reed stylus. Thousands of these tablets have survived, tens of thousands. And when scholars like Samuel Noah Kramer spent decades decoding them in the 20th century, what they found was extraordinary. These were not just records of grain deliveries or royal proclamations. There were epic poems, medical texts, legal codes, philosophical debates, letters from one person to another, a father complaining about his lazy son, a student begging for more time to finish his work, real human voices preserved in clay, speaking to you across 5,000 years. The oldest known piece of literature in human history comes from Sumer. You may know it, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story about a king who loses his best friend, confronts his own mortality, and goes searching for the secret of eternal life. A story about grief, about what it means to be human, written down more than 1,000 years before Homer put a single word of the Iliad onto papyrus. But writing was only the beginning. The Sumerians invented the wheel, not the concept of a round thing rolling, but the actual functional wheel with an axle, used first for pottery and then for transport. They invented the plow. They invented the sailboat. They invented the arch, the dome, the vault. They developed a mathematical system based on the number 60 that we still use today every time you look at a clock or measure a circle. 60 seconds in a minute. 60 minutes in an hour. 360 degrees in a circle. That is Sumer. That is 5,000 years ago, living inside your phone right now. They studied the sky. Sumerian astronomers tracked the movements of the planets with a precision that stunned modern scientists when the tablets were first translated. They identified the 5 visible planets. They calculated the cycles of Venus to within minutes of what we measure today with electronic instruments. The researcher David Pingree, one of the 20th century's greatest historians of ancient science, argued that Sumerian astronomical knowledge was so advanced it formed the direct ancestor of Greek astronomy, which in turn formed the ancestor of modern science. You are not separate from these people, you are downstream from them. And yet, by 2000 BCE, Sumer was already dying. Not all at once, not dramatically, more like a fire going out. The cities shrank. The administrative records became thinner. The great temples fell into disrepair. The language itself, Sumerian, began to be replaced in everyday life by Akkadian, the language of a neighboring culture that had been absorbing Sumerian ideas and institutions for centuries. By 1700 BCE, Sumerian was no longer spoken as a living tongue. It survived only in religious ceremonies and scholarly texts, the way Latin survived in medieval churches long after Rome fell. What happened? Why did the civilization that built the world begin to hollow out from within? Historians have identified several forces working simultaneously. The first was environmental. The land of Sumer, that impossibly fertile river plain, was dying. Ancient irrigation systems, brilliant in their design but relentless in their demands on the soil, had been pulling water from the rivers for centuries. And with that water came salt. Slow accumulation, year after year, field by field. By 2000 BCE, the soil salinity in large parts of southern Mesopotamia had risen to levels where wheat could no longer grow. Agricultural records preserved in clay show the shift clearly. Wheat disappears from the records. Barley, which tolerates salt better, takes over. Then barley yields begin falling too. The breadbasket of the ancient world was quietly poisoning itself. The archaeologist and climate researcher Harvey Weiss spent years studying this collapse and concluded that the civilizational downturn of the late 3rd millennium in Mesopotamia was inseparable from environmental degradation. The cities did not collapse because the people were weak or corrupt. They collapsed because the land beneath them could no longer feed them. The second force was political. Sumer was never a single unified empire. It was a collection of city-states, each with its own ruler, its own patron god, its own army. They traded with each other. They warred with each other. They formed alliances and broke them. This competition drove innovation for a long time, but it also meant that when external pressure arrived, there was no unified response. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian cities around 2334 BCE and imposed its own dynasty. The Sumerians reasserted themselves in what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance under the 3rd dynasty of Ur. But the writing was already on the wall, or rather, pressed into the clay. Then came the Amorites from the west, then the Elamites from the east, then the Assyrians from the north. Each wave absorbed what Sumer had built and added its own layer. The ideas survived. The civilization did not. The third force is the one that haunts archaeologists most. It is the force of forgetting. When the last scribes who could read Sumerian died, something irreplaceable went with them. For 1,500 years, the clay tablets of Sumer sat buried under the desert. Nobody knew they existed. Nobody knew the civilization existed. The Greeks, who considered themselves the fountainhead of all human civilization, had no knowledge of what lay in the ground beneath Babylon. The Romans built their empire unaware that another empire, older and arguably more foundational, had stood in that same region thousands of years before. The people of medieval Europe, of the Islamic Golden Age, of the Renaissance, none of them knew about Sumer. It was only in the 1840s that an archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard began excavating in what is now northern Iraq and started pulling artifacts from the earth that did not match any known civilization. Cuneiform tablets, stone carvings with figures in unfamiliar dress. Then, as more sites were excavated and more tablets decoded, the shape of something vast and previously unknown began to emerge. Scholars realized they were looking at an entirely lost world. Kramer, whose work in the mid-20th century did more than almost anyone else to translate and publicize Sumerian literature, titled one of his landmark books, History Begins at Sumer. He meant it literally. The oldest historical records in the world are Sumerian records. Before Sumer, there are things humans made. After Sumer, there is history. What does it mean that we forgot them? It means that civilization is more fragile than we think. It means that the things we consider permanent, language, knowledge, institutional memory, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, can be lost, not in a dramatic apocalypse, quietly, gradually, through a slow withdrawal of the conditions that made them possible. The Sumerians knew this in their way. The Epic of Gilgamesh ends not with triumph, but with acceptance. Gilgamesh returns from his quest for immortality empty-handed. The secret of eternal life slips from his grasp, and he stands before the walls of his city, Uruk, and he looks at what he has built. The text tells us he runs his hand along the baked bricks. He examines the foundation. He considers the craftsmanship, and the poem suggests, gently, that this is enough. that the city itself is his legacy, that what he built will outlast him. He was right, and he was wrong. Uruk outlasted Gilgamesh by centuries, but it did not outlast time. It is dust now, under the desert of modern Iraq. The walls are gone. The temples are rubble. The people who walked those streets and wrote those tablets and mapped those stars are names in clay, if they are names at all. And yet, you looked at a clock today. You measured an angle or thought about one. You told a story or listened to one, built on structures of narrative that trace back through Homer and back further still to the scribes of ancient Uruk pressing reeds into wet clay by lamplight. The civilization that built the world did not disappear. It dissolved into everything that came after. You are still living inside it. You just forgot where it came from. Now you know.